Hey guys, it's Antiquated Ideas, and today I want to talk about patriotism, nationalism, and how that applies to specifically America. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and it's sort of on topic, but it's a quick little tangent, is that I've put up a picture of what you would see as American patriotism. So now what you're looking at is what would be Polish nationalism. Not that there is much of a difference, because in both regards, it's people who support their country, their culture, their beliefs, things of those sorts. The only difference is that in Poland, they're openly advocating for the preference of their own country before any other country in the European Union. They don't think that people should be able to just freely come and go through their country as they please. No, they want to preserve their own country. And I think that as an American, Americans could learn a lot from Poland. Even though I'm not Polish, I can't completely talk about it, but this is just my observation on it. But if you want to learn more about that, check out my bio. There's a link to my blog, and I've written extensively about it. I've written about other things like militias in Poland and in Italy and how those things work. Anyway, back to the topic. So, the first thing you might be wondering is, if I'm talking about patriotism and nationalism, what's the difference? Well, Google defines patriotism as the quality of being patriotic, devotion to, and vigorous support for one's country. Now, that sounds pretty good, all right? Let's get to nationalism. Nationalism is identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. So, why is there a discrepancy between the two? Aren't they the same? Well, I think that they are. I think that they are exactly the same thing, but yet people feel the need to define these two things differently because patriotism is, I suppose, a uniquely American experience. That's what we would call the sentiment of Americans towards America in most cases. Yet, in the definition of nationalism, it becomes overly confusing and wordy, saying that instead of just devotion to and vigorous support for one's country, it's identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. So, as an example of why they're taught differently, why they're defined differently. In school, you most likely learned about World War I. And when you learned about World War I, at least when I learned about it, we were taught that the man who killed Franz Ferdinand was a Serbian nationalist. They didn't talk about how he might have been a radical. They didn't talk about how he might have been a terrorist. No, all they say is that he was a nationalist, which immediately paints the picture that nationalists are these people that are they're thugs or they're assassins. They're separate from the law. But when we talk about our own revolution in America, we call them patriots. We don't call them nationalists, even though they were, by definition, nationalists. And we don't condemn their actions in the same way that we might condemn other quote-unquote nationalists. An interesting topic in this regard would be the IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army. And that's Irish nationalists who feel the need to have a separate Ireland, unified Ireland from Great Britain. And inherently, there's nothing wrong with that. Irish people want to stick with other Irish people and not be ruled by another country. They want to unify their country for themselves. Well, the problem with the IRA is that during a point in the Troubles, which was a period from the 20s to, the late 80s, I suppose, the IRA started crossing over into what we would consider terrorism when they started using car bombs to threaten the government. And a lot of these car bombs killed more civilians than they did anyone else, which is what created the problem and what created anti-IRA sentiment. Even though they initially were fighting for a good cause. But you can look at that in regards to a lot of other countries. And it also, I think, applies to what nationalism and what patriotism are. Terrorism and nationalism or patriotism are completely two different things. That's what happens when somebody becomes radical. Yet we're not taught that there's a difference there. So if we think about how this applies in America, if you look at gun laws, if you look at militias, both of these things are protected by our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. Yet politicians are allowed to take away these things and more. So being a nationalist or being a patriot, and I'm just going to say a patriot from now on because it's more familiar to a lot of Americans, I think. Being a patriot is raising the question of, well, when Donald Trump created a law, an executive order no less, that protects Jews, isn't that outside of our protection of freedom of speech? I mean, it's raising the question of, at what point do these men, these tyrants, if you will, what point do they stop? In regards to the revolution, people have been killed for less, but we don't talk about the revolutionaries as being terrorists. No, because they stood up for their beliefs and they aimed not just at politicians, but they aimed at the people who were involved in being actively anti-American. Now, I know that's not really a thing, being anti-American then, because America was just a British colony. But it created this sentiment among Americans then, among colonists, that if America wasn't going to have equal representation, they might as well be their own country. So we have successfully gone through that revolution. We create our own country, and a very unique country, a very good country, one of the best on earth, I think. And people now are saying that it's wrong to believe in the Constitution. It's wrong to ask questions. I mean, it's like, what is this, the 1970s again, where we're going to have to go through another Vietnam to show that the government isn't there to always support you, to always baby you and take care of you? Well, I was watching a movie on Netflix the other day with my girlfriend, a documentary, but a movie no less. And I know what you're thinking is that, okay, well, Netflix has obvious biases, prejudices against certain people, certain groups, and especially in regards to this movie. So the movie I believe it's just called Gray State, and it's about a guy who is making excuse me, it's about a guy who is making a movie called Gray State, and that's about getting into like FEMA camps and how we live in a police state and so on and so forth. And initially, I thought it was going to be bad, but it was actually a really good movie. So if you feel like checking that out, I would highly recommend it. This guy is talking about how people disappear in the night, whistleblowers, how police are incredibly armed. Anyway, on the topic of police and where they fit in with this, and where they fit in with the Constitution. And that's what being a patriot is about, is I think, anyway, that's the defining characteristic, is believing in the Constitution above all else. The police are allowed to get away with whatever they want in most regards. A quick example of that is I know somebody that when she was in high school, police policeman was around the corner, pulled her over, and then he proceeded to mention that if she were to do a sexual favor for him, he might let her out of a ticket. Now, she didn't do that, and he ended up not giving her a ticket, just letting her off with a warning because she was 16 at the time. But if you were to bring that up, a lot of people would get mad, and the police would, first of all, the policeman in question would probably be sent home with full pay, mind you, because they get paid with our taxes. And there would be some sort of investigation, and then the police would target you, unfortunately. But that's why I say they're allowed to get away with whatever they please in most regards. If you're involved in a home defense shooting, no matter what happens, no matter how calm you are when you call 911, the police are going to show up with assault rifles. They're going to put you down on the ground, hold you at gunpoint, and they are going to ransack your home. They're going to take all your guns from you, and you may not ever see them again. And God knows what else they might take from you. Police today, they are armed to the teeth, just like a soldier. But on average, they receive less training than even a National Guardsman would, and they're allowed to be turned loose on the public. Yet the quote-unquote red flag gun laws that are often used against lawful gun owners have been used multiple times against civilians with more training than most police have. Yet you don't see these civilians going out and killing or wounding or doing generally illegal things, especially not in any group affiliation like the police. No, these are people who are mindful of what the laws are. They exercise their constitutional rights. And yes, they go out and they use guns, and they might post on their social media that they represent what they stand for, but there's nothing wrong with that because what they stand for is well within the confines of the law. So when it comes down to self-defense and the militia and what you're allowed to do, you take a look at the Constitution, and the right to bear arms isn't the first thing on there. It's the second. But I think that's incredibly important. I think that placement is purposeful because the right to bear arms is the key to securing all of your other rights. But it's not the first one. The first one is freedom of speech. So I think that implies that you're not supposed to immediately turn to your weapons to change things. We have freedom of speech. So we need to exercise that. And importantly, any good patriot knows that we'll try to keep the peace and sway other people's minds, but the right to bear arms and defend oneself is important in doing so. The right to bear arms prevents you from being threatened into silence by a government or by corporations or by the police or whoever it is. So being a patriot means that you have to know that. You have to have that mindset, and you have to be able to be vigilant in it in practice. The physical aspect and the mental aspect of it. A patriot needs to keep themselves ready, just like a Minuteman would have during the times of the Revolution. They need to have mental fortitude, just as they might physical strength. I mean, if something were to happen, you need to know enough to be able to educate somebody else and have them pass it down the line. And, of course, this comes with the mindset of knowing who you are. And at the foremost, you are a protector. You're protecting people's rights, and you're protecting people's lives. Any person with knowledge of morals would know that the strong protect the weak. That's what they're there to do. Because even if you have good intentions, you might be afraid to stand up for yourself, and you might be afraid to stand up for other people. Part of being a patriot is knowing, part of being a nationalist is knowing that you need to protect other people just as much as you need to protect yourself. You need to be strong where others are weak. You need to stand up for them where they aren't going to stand up for themselves. And the Founding Fathers knew this. That's what they intended for us to be. But when the time comes, you need to be able to act. You can talk all you want, but if it's getting nowhere, you need to be able to act. You need to be able to stand up to the government, to the police, or to whatever opposition holds sway, and you need to be fearless and know that you are in the right, because it's never wrong to protect God-given rights for yourself or for others. Anyone that says it's wrong, and there will be a lot of people that say it's wrong, they've been brainwashed. They believe a lie. You know in your heart, or at least you should, that protecting yourself and protecting other people who can't protect themselves is the right thing to do. And I know that a lot of times that can seem like you're on the fringe if you believe in those things, or you might feel like you're a radical because people make you out to be radical if you believe in those things. But believe me, you aren't. There are millions of other Americans who believe exactly the same things. They're ready to die for their rights. They're ready to die to protect those rights, because what's most important is it's not you. It's having those rights be preserved for other people. Not just your neighbor, not just somebody across the country, but for your children, for your children's children, and so that they know that they are able to live in a safe country, whether it be from external or internal threat. And I think that's why the Founding Fathers were such advocates for militias, and that's why militias still exist today. And as is the case in Florida, there are a couple of states that outlaw militias, despite it being completely unconstitutional, just like Virginia trying to take away firearms, which is completely unconstitutional. Militias should be allowed to be open to the public for anyone who's interested, whether they're new to it, whether they've been in the military, whether they've been in the police, whether they don't have affiliation with any of that, whether it's just somebody who's interested in their country and their beliefs and they want to help other people. And militias are great for that, because militias offer you the opportunity to learn, not necessarily just how to use a gun, but also they teach you a lot of important life-saving skills when it comes to medicine. Like, I mean, I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but learning to use a tourniquet. People in militias, oftentimes they'll have one or two or more people that have basic medical training, if not more extensive. And of course, you can always go to the hospital and learn, but it's important that you remain vigilant in educating yourself in those things, especially if you're interested in this. And again, don't let anyone tell you that it's radical, because it isn't. It's not radical to want to learn to protect yourself and to protect others. If anything, that's more noble than becoming part of a corporation or part of an evil government and just following orders, taking things from people as you please because that's what your orders are, because that's what somebody told you to do, and you don't want to think about it. I guarantee you most of those people who do what they do, they know that it's wrong. And I think that red flag gun laws are completely immoral, just as they are unconstitutional. I mean, go ahead and argue with me. Tell me how gun control saves lives, but it doesn't. The only thing that saves lives is having the proper mentality and knowing when and where to use your firearm. I don't even think that there should be licenses when it comes to concealed carry, because I think that ideally everyone should be exposed to firearms from a young age. Learn that they're a tool. I mean, they're not to be played around with, because if you've ever been taught how to use a gun, they'll tell you, and one of the first things that they'll tell you is don't point a gun at anything you're not willing to destroy or kill. And a lot of people nowadays, they like to play around with guns. The problem also is not with, and this is for another video, of course, but it's not with people who lawfully own guns. It's with people who illegally own guns. Anytime that gun control is passed, all it does is hurt people who are lawful owners. Anyway, on the topic of training, if you're interested, even if you aren't part of a militia and you just want to get into training, that's perfectly fine, and I would encourage it. Train yourself physically first, because training yourself physically also helps with training yourself mentally. If you're physically strong, it contributes to you being mentally strong. If you're physically weak, a lot of times you would be mentally weak. And there are a lot of people, that believe that's how things were a lot in the old days too. But again, that's another topic. So let's talk about guns specifically, the physical training aspect of it. If you're going to go out onto the range, don't just practice your fancy transitions and learning how to mag dump on a target. Learn whatever weapon platform you have, whether it's an AK, an AR, a bolt-action rifle, a pump-action shotgun. I mean, it really doesn't matter, because when it comes down to it, anything is deadly in the hands of somebody who's trained and who has the correct mentality. So learn your weapon platform and learn it with and without all of your, your fancy advanced sights, because just as important as it is to learn it with a red dot sight or a holographic sight, it's important to know how to use just a bare bones rifle. It's important to learn how to use it without grips or without a light trigger or whatever modifications. Another very important aspect is learning small unit tactics. Learn to maneuver with a friend or two. Go out in an empty field and don't even bring a gun. Just go out in an empty field with a couple of friends of yours and learn field tactics, learn communication, learn how to properly form a battle line. And again, I'm hesitant to talk about these things because I wasn't in the military, though I am interested. And I think that it's acceptable for me to talk about it because I am interested and I'm trying to share my knowledge with you and get you interested in these things as well. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important that you are trained enough that you can train somebody else who's interested and they can pass that information on down the line, because God knows what's going to happen. If it's a combat situation, people die. If it's not a combat situation, maybe you need refreshers, or maybe you run into people who they're interested, but they're not quite ready to join a militia, or they're not ready to join the army, or whatever it is. Anyway, being able to adapt to your situation is incredibly important. You need to have enough knowledge that you're able to think about alternate courses of action so that as your scenario changes, you can adapt and change yourself to fit into that, to find whatever's most effective. Learn when and where to engage. I have on the screen a couple of small unit formations. Learn those. Learn what flanking is. Learn what rate of fire is and why that's important, because that is incredibly important. But also, most importantly, learn how to communicate and adapt so that yourself, your team, or innocent people don't get hurt. And with that comes medical exercises. So a lot of times local hospitals, probably on the weekends or something, or later in the day, they'll have training courses where you can go and, even at the most basic, learn, the Heimlich maneuver or learn CPR. But you should learn how to tie a tourniquet. You could learn how to decompress somebody's chest if they're choking on blood. I mean, I have a quote-unquote go bag that I keep, and I keep it in my car. And mostly it's filled with, I have compressed toilet paper in there, because they're real small, like for camping. They fit in there real well. It's got like a little water bladder that you could fill up and take it with the bag. And most importantly, it has my medical kit in there, which it's just basic, but it's still important to have. I have gauze, I have bandages, I have tourniquets, some scissors, a Sharpie, a couple of other things. So, even just start with learning your blood type and going out and making small investments, because this is an investment. It's an investment in yourself and your knowledge, and you should have this knowledge. Knowing these things can and most likely will save somebody's life someday. If you were in a car accident, if you were injured on the job, you would want somebody else to know these things so that they were able to come and help you. A lot of times, first responders aren't going to be the first people there. So you need somebody else to rely on, in the same way as a shooting. If you saw somebody go into your neighbor's house, okay, maybe your neighbor is an elderly person, you need to be able to go in and assess the situation. If you're in a gas station and the gas station's getting robbed, imagine there are other people around. There's the clerk, maybe there's a mother and her child in the back. If you conceal carry, this is all that you're about. You need to be ready for that situation. You need to be able to properly assess it and determine what the threat is and when to act. And whether it comes down to it in a civilian shooting or a combat scenario, these are all important things. And they all fall in line with being a patriot or being a nationalist and believing in the Constitution and believing in morals and rights. Like I said, it's not radical to believe in these things. What is radical is believing in, however people do it, believing in taking away rights from people, taking away their means to defend themselves and defend others. See, people like me can be self-sufficient. I can protect myself even if there aren't police around. And maybe that day happens. We've seen it as an example with the LA race riots, and I think it was 92. The police, they couldn't handle what was going on, so people took it upon themselves to defend themselves. I mean, the Koreans were a huge example of that. That's more American than, I would say, half of the Americans today that go out and protest Trump or do whatever fucking stupid-ass thing they feel like they're going to do. Just as it's not radical to see what the government's doing, to see how people are indeed brainwashed to believe in the police and to believe in the government. I mean, it's like these people have learned nothing. Like in Vietnam, I mean, it only started occurring to people when the news was showing on TV people dying and how we were losing. And the government, they were telling us that we were winning the whole time, saying that it was good. These people were dying for a cause. No, they weren't. Nobody was dying for anything in Vietnam except stupidity. I mean, there is a whole process in which they recruited people specifically below a certain IQ. But again, that's another topic for a different thing. Or MK Ultra. As if the government couldn't harm you, as if they don't plan on it, and as if they don't monitor us. I mean, I'm sure that they monitor me just the same as that guy that made Gray State. He knew that people were watching him, and that's not being paranoid, that's just being realistic. So, be vigilant, educate yourself, be prepared, and above all else, pray and hope that, things don't come to that. But if they do, you need to be ready, and you need to be able to protect yourself and ensure that others are protected. Anyway, if you like this video, feel free to check out my bio. There's links to my blog, to my Patreon, and my PayPal. And if you want me to make a video or write a blog about any other topic, please feel free to like and leave a comment. Thank you.